All right, folks. So for our first activity, we're going to make something called a unit circle measuring tool. Okay. Now, as a frame of reference, somewhere in life, and if you haven't heard this before, I'm going to define it. A unit circle is a circle where the radius is 1 and the center is at the 0, 0, or the origin point on the Cartesian coordinate plane. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. What you need to do this activity is a blank sheet of paper. You're going to need a ruler, and you are going to need an assortment of different color pens. These I stole from my wife, who is a Spanish teacher. So I need to make sure I get these back to her when I'm done with the activity. But if you'd like to, take a minute, pause this video, and go get your materials. All right, so now that you have your materials, here's the first thing you do. You just fold it like this. So the first thing you do is you're going to come to this side, the edge of the piece of paper, and you are going to measure out, let's start with black pen, every inch. So make a hash mark at 1 inch, 2 inches, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you really do have to be fairly accurate about this, okay? And then after you measure it out, number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, now, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to take some scissors and cut out, let's say cut this out as a strip, maybe about like, I don't know, an inch or two. Like that. You need to pause the video and go ahead and take that. Okay. If you remember from your activity, for the pre-course activity, we learned that pi is approximately 3.14. And the whole purpose of this activity is for you to really see pi as a number, as opposed to this goofy symbol, an actual number that's meaningful to you. Now, if pi is equal to 3.14, that means that 2 pi is approximately 6.28, okay? So here's what we're going to do is I'm going to take the red pen right here, and I'm going to come over to this and trying to estimate about where 6.28 is on my little number line. So this number right here is, that looks like about 6.5, right? And then if I go take half of that, that's about 6.25, right? So 6.25 is equal to 6.25. So I'm just going to come a little bit past a quarter. Oh, 1 second, let me get some red going. Ah, useless. Switch to a different color. I guess we'll do it in pink. Come to about a little bit past 6.25 to this point right here, and we're going to call that 2 pi. Now, if you have to, you can remind yourself that this is about 6.28. So on the number line, this is the approximate location of 2 pi. Now, remember, all the way over here is the 0 point. Now, this is pretty slick. What I can do is I can take this piece of paper, and now I'm going to take it over here and fold it in half by putting that 0 point at 6.28 And by folding it at half, I'm essentially taking this 2 pi and I'm dividing it by 2, right? Which means that this number right here is, wait for it, correct. That is pi, which if you look at it, it looks like it's at about the 3.14 spot. So this distance from here to here is 3 units. This distance from here to here is pi units, or about 3.14. That's about 3.5. That's about 3.25. That's about 3 1/8. So 3.14 is somewhere between like 3 1/8, 3 1/4, right? It's a number, and it has a location on the number line. Okay, so here's what we're going to do next. We are now going to take this pi, and we're going to divide it in half. How are we going to divide it in half? You got it. We're going to fold it. So I'm going to take this thing. I'm going to fold the half, just like that. All right. Which takes us to this point right here, right? So this point right here is, what would it be? Well, pi over 2. And the whole idea is pi over 2 is, as a reminder, it's half of pi, or half of 3.14. If you were to take this and put it in your calculator, you would find out that this number right here is approximately 1 point, what is it? 1.57, I believe. Yep, 1.57. So in other words, 1.57 is a little bit bigger than a half, which that actually makes sense because if you look carefully, that right there is about 1.5. And if you go a little bit more, 0.07 in particular, that takes you to pi over 2. Okay. Now, there's also a number between here and here. So here's what we're going to do. So we're going to take this half, and then we're going to fold this half and half, and then I'm going to mark right there. And actually, if you notice, you kind of just mark it just a little bit underneath that crease. Okay, I want you to take a minute, pause the video, and try and guess, as a fractional unit, if this is pi over 2, and if this is pi, and if this is 2 pi, what would you call that distance in terms of pi? So take a minute, pause the video, think about it, and then take it from there. Okay? All right, so that particular point is 3 pi over 2. Okay? So if you think about it in terms of fraction, this is pi, this is half of a pi, right? It's 1/2 of this distance. And then if you take this 3 halves, if you think about it, it's 1.5 is what 3 halves, if you want to do it as a decimal, right? So this is half of a pi, this is 1 full unit of pi, this is 1.5 or 3 halves pi, and if you go another half pi, that takes us to 2 pi, okay? And this is our unit. And again, keep in mind that when I say half of a pi, pi over 2, 1.57, I'm saying the same thing. And I think that's a big disconnect that a lot of students have, okay? So now here's what I can do. I'm going to change colors. I'll grab purple, see if that works. Yeah, purple works. I'm going to take this pi over 2, and I'm going to fold it right here. Okay? All right, so I took pi over 2, folded it in half, so this mark would be what? So if this is half of a pi, if I took half of a half, that would be, okay, if you said pi over 4, that's how probably your Algebra 2 trig teacher But all I'm doing is I'm taking 1/4 of a pi. Those are equivalent quantities. And think about this. If pi over 2 is the same thing as 1.57, well, if I take 1.57 and divide it by 2, that gives me approximately 0.707 is what that comes out to be. Wait a minute, is that right? No, that's not right. Oops, sorry. I just was confusing that with another trig concept. Actually, that would be, if I divide this by 2, all right, fine. Let's just do the math because I don't have to put my calculator. All right, 1.57 divided by 2. There's my decimal point. That is the 7. 14, 1, 17. 2 goes in 17 8 times. 16, 1, 0. Oh, 0.785. Duh. Okay. All right, sorry about that. Okay, 0.785 is a little bit more accurate. Okay, here's why this is important. 0.785, if you take a look at it, this point right here is about 1/2. This is about 3/4, which is 0.75. 0.785 is just a little bit bigger than 3/4. So again, the key is I want you to start associating this expression, pi over 4, with these numbers or those concepts. Does that make sense? And then if I take this quarter distance and I fold it over again, okay, this is 1/4 pi, 2/4 is 1/2. This right here is 3/4 of the distance to pi. 1/4, 2/4, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, or 1 pi, right? I can keep going. I can take this, and if I fold it again, now, let me say this. Every time you fold it, you're actually pushing the distance a little over, so I'm going to kind of... Ooh, I want to make sure I get this right, though. So 3/4, 4/4 of a pi. Wait, 3/4. This is 5/4 of a pi. This is kind of interesting. Here's what's cool. You guys got to help me out. I'll let you figure this out. So if I fold this over, notice that I'm folding it by 4ths of a pi. And when I fold it over, here's what's interesting. It almost it's going to be really close to 4, right? And should I put my mark to this side of 4 or that side of 4, right? Okay. Well, here's how we think about it. There's 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. This is 5/4 of a pi. So here's my question. 5 pi over 4. Is that thing, which way does this go? Is it greater than 4 or is it less than 4? Which direction does it go? That's kind of interesting. I'll let you actually figure that out. So you need to make sure that you can figure out which side of 4 that goes on to. Okay. So those are the quarter points. And so there's going to be a pi over 4, a 3 pi over 4. This is 4 pi over 4. You're going to have a 5 pi over 4 somewhere in here. Let me just mark that down. Somewhere in here, you're going to have a 5 pi over 4. You've got to figure out which side of 4 is it on. This is 6 pi over 4, right? 6 pi over 4 will simplify to 3 pi over 2. There's a 7 pi over 4 somewhere in here, right? You've got to figure out where that is. And again, use your folding method, but also use your calculator to figure out the decimal equivalent. I can kind of guesstimate. It's going to be bigger than 5.5, but looks like smaller than 5 3/4. So somewhere between 5.5 and 5.75. It should be somewhere in here. And then 7 pi over 5, 4, and then 2 pi is 8 pi over 4. Okay, so there's that. All right, now we're going to grab another color of pen. Okay. All right, the next color of pen is, again, we're going to start out here with pi. And this is going to be kind of a trickier fold. Halves folds are pretty easy, but here's what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and fold this in thirds, right? So if I this is going to be kind of tricky. So you got to figure out a way to take this. If you look at it, I think nope. Kind of have to eyeball it. So when I fold this point over here, I think what should happen, nope, gotta take it back just a hair. Okay. This one's the tricky one. There we go. I think that's pretty close. So what I've done is I tried to fold it so that this distance right here is 1/3. And then if I go another third, that takes me to pi. Okay. Now, this is where the folding's pretty accurate. And knowing conceptually, I'm pretty close. This right here, I'll do this in green, was 1/3, 2/3. So this is pi over 3. So 1/3, 2/3 pi, 3/3 pi, right? This is 3 pi over 3. Okay. So this is 2 pi over 3. Now here's what's interesting. Let's take a look at this number, 3 pi over 3. Pi over 3 is equal to, well, pi is about what? Approximately 3.14. I'll put an approximate now. Divided by 3. This number, if you look at it, is a little bit bigger than 1, right? Because 3 over 3 is equal to 1, right? So 3.143 is a little bit bigger than 1. So pi over 3 must be a little bit bigger than 1. Okay, what does that look like on our ruler? Coming back to our unit circle ruler, here's where 1 is. Notice that pi over 3 is a little bit bigger than 1. So then right here, there's another third here. And then whatever this distance is, here's one way you can do it, is you can take your paper and measure out. I know that the distance from, and do a little bit of, from here, this right here is pi over 3, right? That distance. So what you can do is, if I come over here, that right there, if this is 3 pi over 3, I add another pi over 3, so that is 4 pi over 3. Then I come over here. By the way, when you plug 4 pi over 3 in your calculator, approximately what should it come out to be on terms of a decimal number? Just estimate. I would call it about 4 1/4 if we did our drawing right. This is 4 pi over 3. This is 5 pi over 3. And then we're going to do one more right here. This last one should take me to about 6 pi over 3. And 6 pi over 3 should take me to about 1/3. Okay, I can see that my ruler's a little off because this distance doesn't match up. So these numbers in here might be a little off, but I think it's close enough. So that's the pi over 3. All right, last color, purple. This one's not too bad. These are our pi over 3 numbers. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to fold the 1/3 pi in half. And what's half of a third? Well, think about it. 1/2 of 1/3 is 1/6, right? If you got a third of a piece of pizza, if you take a half of it, then you got a sixth of a piece of pizza. So if this right here is pi over 3, then in purple, this is pi over 6. And you can see that when you take pi over 6 on your calculator, you should be getting somewhere around 1/2, somewhere around 0.5. A little bit bigger, a little bit less, somewhere in there. So that's the distance from here. Then you need to do right here. You go 1/6, 2/6, 3/6. So that means, because these are fractions, 1/6, 2/6, 3/6 gives me pi over 2. I think that might have freaked some of you guys out. Let me do that math for you. So 3 pi over 6, right? That's equal to pi over 2, right? So that's why I don't have to draw a purple mark right there. 4/6 takes me to 2/3. That might have freaked you out a little bit, so let me do that one for you. 4 pi over 6, that's equal to 2 pi over 3 when you simplify those fractions. So that's that 2 pi over 3. But then I go another 1/6, this distance right here, and I cut it in half. That is 5 pi over 6. And again, when you run the decimal numbers, you should get somewhere around 2.75, maybe a little bit smaller than it is what it looks like, right? So this is 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6. Again, the distance from here to here, 7 pi over, let's see, 6 pi over 6. This is 7 pi over 6. This is 8 pi over 6. This is 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, and then somewhere in between here is 11 pi over 6. Okay. All right. So this right here gives you, in terms of number lines, and here's what I'd like you to do is make this ruler, and then I want you to verify, type pi over 6 in your calculator and verify that it's about 1/2. Type pi over 4 in your calculator and verify that it's kind of about 0.75. There's your one. Kind of go through and just kind of guesstimate and just verify that your colored marks here are fairly accurate. Got it?